Get off my chair. Move it. Go. Go. Dink. Right. Mhm. Okay. So,
Mm.
Ow. Psst, 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 psst. Okay, it's 7 o'clock. I can start talking now. I'm going to get a power cord and make it turn. Safety first. Where are we? There we go. Safety first. That's safe. No problem there. So this poor thing sits there going all day long. The motor never turns off. This is going to get plugged into my one of my computers. I want to read some old discs with it. Yeah, it doesn't use very much power. The thing with these drives, actually, I'll show you something. If you look at the, I was showing this solenoid here. Actually, easier if I close the bail. Okay, so this can be operated electronically, and so that they don't have head wear, that solenoid moves the head onto the disk. So when the computer's not reading, the disk is not in contact with the heads. Also, there's a pressure pad here. You can't easily see it. See if I can zoom in a bit. If I put the disk in, you'll see what happens. So, put in a disk. Now you can see right here, the bail has a pad that can touch the disk. And so when I close the bail, it's loaded, but it's not touching. And when the head is loaded, this pad in here presses on the disk, and it makes the wiper jacket inside the disk clean the disk. So there's no load, no torque at all when it's not reading. But as soon as it wants to read, it presses down on the pad and the head at the same time. It's kind of a nice setup. Later on, these drives, they actually did turn the motor on and off. But for the early ones, yeah, the motor would sit there going as long as the computer was on. So with this one, I'm going to make it probably, I don't know, I haven't decided. I could do it either way. I could make a circuit so that the computer turns on the motor just like normal, like you would have with a modern drive. Or I might leave it the way it is and leave the motor running and make it so that the motor signal from the PC just activates the head loading mechanism instead. So there's two ways I could do it. But other than that, it's pretty close to the way a normal drive works, a modern drive. There's some small differences in electronic signaling. The boards are so beautiful. And if you want to take the board out, they even make it easy. All the connectors, everything just plugs in. And you loosen 2 screws. And then these levers move out of the way. And the board just comes right out, just like that. Beautifully made. And typical of old IBM, they have their own custom chips made in-house in these metal cans, the square cans. And so you can see there's a controller how did they do this? So they've got head amplifiers over here, stepper motor drivers, which were conventional ICs in this case. There's a little bit of regular logic, Texas Instruments, that kind of thing. Some buffer amplifiers. But IBM was famous for these strange square chips all over the place. They would even implement things like 8086 processors in these chips. And you'll notice the entire board is done as a grid of square pads. And so one side has horizontal traces. It's not easy to see here, but you can kind of see them. They're going along the length of the board. And the other side has vertical traces going the opposite way. And they did all the boards in these things just like this. I have some system controllers over there that these drives came from. And the boards are all done exactly the same way, no matter what they're for. So it's kind of nice. Very nice construction. And very serviceable. Everything on this drive comes out. And the manual explains how to rebuild the whole thing, how to calibrate it and set everything up. And there's even tools included. Like here, this is a tool for aligning the stepper motor. So you push this in through the pulley, and it aligns it to track 0, just included in the drive. And then on the opposite side, more tools included as part of the drive. So these are spring clips for applying feeler gauges to check the position of the heads for loading. So you take this small clip and you put a feeler gauge here, and the clip holds the feeler gauge in place so that you can align the head stop so it stops in the correct position. So these tools they put them in IBM hardware all over the place to make life easy for the technician. And thankfully, I've never seen them missing. They're usually not missing. So they don't do things like this anymore. Nothing at all like that. So I'll put the board back in. Such a nice thing. You just flip the levers, tighten the screws, plug it all in. Complete field serviceability. And that's it. The only other thing that's interesting about this, you can see the Berg connector right here is 36 pins. Of course, modern PC floppy drives use 34 pins, so I don't have anything that'll plug in. I've got to order a new connector for this before I could start this project. But I'll be designing an interface that this will work with so that I can connect it to a modern PC. And thankfully, the geometry of the IBM Type 2 floppy is very close to that of the 5 1/4 inch floppy. Although still, I probably will have to circumvent BIOS control and operate the controller directly in order to use this drive, because there are a few things that are slightly different. But like I said, it's close enough, it'll work. And then I can start archiving these old discs. Plus, it might just be fun to be able to store things on a couple of these old floppies. So that's that thing. I got 2 of these recently. I'm very happy to have them. They're really hard to find now. So I see Sater is talking about the boards. Hold on a moment. I'm going to clear off the bench. I will grab the machine that this drive comes from and show you what it looks like. It's absolutely beautiful. The system is a serial multiplexer to attach terminals to an IBM System 360 compatible mainframe. So this multiplexer would be attached via a serial or dial-up modem link to a mainframe somewhere, and it provides connections for 16 IBM desktop terminals, printers, or other compatible devices via single-wire serial interfaces. And the floppy drives are used to hold the program for the machine and all of its settings, so that it was configured based on the user's end application. If they had to change the machine or anything like that, they just pull the machine, pull the disk, switch it out, and away it goes. It's just like a firmware update. A firmware was stored on an 8-inch floppy. So I'll get the controller here. So no, this is not a microwave oven. So here it is. The lighting isn't so good, sorry. You can kind of see the front. So the disk drive was in here. You can see there's just a hole now. I can put it back in easily enough. It's got power and a couple of basic settings. And on the back, so there's RS-232 serial interface. Nothing special there. And then these coaxial connectors, the BNC connectors, are IBM's way of connecting terminals. So every terminal would have a single coax, and that's it. So you can see there's 16 there. So quite a big unit just to do 16 serial ports. You know, nowadays this would fit on a tiny circuit board. But what's beautiful about this is how it comes apart and how it's built. Before I open the top, I'm going to show you the bottom. So the cooling is really interesting. You can see it's got a raised floor, and there's fans in here, and the air is pumped out through the periphery beneath the bottom of the device. So it sucks the air in through the top, and it sends it out the bottom, which is unusual, but that's how they decided to do it. It works very nicely. It's quiet. Again, nicely made. These covers are cast aluminum. There's no plastic here at all. This is solid aluminum. This is aluminum back here. Aluminium. So let's open it up. Again, in the interest of field serviceability, these use quarter turn screws, just 2 of them. So just pop in a key there. That's one side. The other. Off with the lid. Now here's my favorite thing about this whole thing. If you want service information, you look inside the lid. Pop open the cover, and the books for the unit stay inside. There's more books for this, but I have them out right now because I'm studying the drive operation, but they keep the service manual inside. Again, this is the way everybody should do this sort of thing. So that's the lid. Nothing much to say about it. But here's the beautiful part of this thing. You can see this is where the floppy drive used to sit. So if we get the drive, this would have sat in there right like that. And as a matter of fact, what I think I'll do is assemble it and I'll fire it up because you get to see the drive working. This thing still works. So first I'll put the power connector for the drive back together. I've got a little cover. All right. So I must have this upside down. Yes, I do. Okay. So that's the power. Now you'll notice with old IBM equipment, power would always come into a box, which had the fuse and the filters and everything inside it. And it would be distributed via connections to all of the other devices and loads in the unit, including connections to the power switch on the front panel. Very modular, like just such a nice way to build things. I kept the screws in the bag for the drive, so I will screw the drive back in place. Now, a little while ago when I got this, I actually took apart the drive and I repacked all of the bearings in the motor and in the pulley with new grease. This thing can be worked on like a car. Now I probably put the drive in out of order. You're supposed to put the front in first, but whatever. So those all set in there. Use a wrench on the other side. Of course, while I'm on video, we get one screw that's a little tight. So bear with me. Organic oil. Yes. These drives prefer sesame oil. Just kidding. All right, that's tight. Plug in the interface cable. Okay, so that's in there. Before I turn it on, I want to show you the main board area. So, again, in the interest of serviceability, we have plug-in cards. Now I can remove the hold-down rails. Might lose a bit of old foam here. It's crumply. Oops. This is fine. I was wanting to replace this foam anyway, so I'll take it apart. Okay, so the cards just pop right out. And again, there's more of those funny looking square chips. All sorts of them. And this particular board, this one's an interface controller. So nothing too crazy going on there. But let's look at the processor. So this has got the CPU. You can see a whole bunch of RAM, CPU there, or that's the CPU, I don't know, one of the two. So you can see there's a Motorola device on there and a whole bunch of IBM custom devices. And I wouldn't be surprised if one of these custom devices is actually an 8086 or an 8088 processor. Hell, it could even be an 8085 or an 8080. This has plus and minus 5 volt power, so NMOS devices would be possible. It might be an 8080, I don't know. If it is, I'd like to find out. I'd like to reprogram this and use it for something else. So we'll get it back together. I'll show you my other favorite thing about this, how this is done. You can see there's two screws you can't really see in here. If I undo these, this is how you do field serviceability. So this whole unit can pop out. There's the power supply. Again, this, you just push these two tabs out of your way. A little bit of a squeeze. Let's see, do this properly. Undo the cable. Oh, ha! They put a zap strap in there. Never mind that. In any case, you can see how this might come out. Looks like I'd have to remove this lock here in order to undo the power connector, but you get the idea. The whole thing just comes apart. and take you in for a closer look. So there's the cooling fans, the back plane, power supply. There's those nice BNC connectors. And just, you see there's that nice die cast aluminum, both front and back. Twisted pair cable for the floppy drive. Good stuff. I think these were about $25,000. So you got what you paid for. So let's turn it on. Use only the best Apple computer power cables for reasons. I won't say what reasons, just reasons. Plug it in. Make sure it's off. Okay. All right. So it's plugged in. I've got the floppy in there. Let's see if it works. Again, I'll take you in closer. You can see it's awake. Should start some flashing. And it's reading. And I think it'll read some more in a moment. I don't know how long it takes. It's still showing me this code. Let's try initializing it. That is just so satisfying to watch. So I'll do it again and we can look from the other side. You can watch the little solenoid. There it goes. So that's an IBM 51TD floppy drive, capable of everything up to a IBM Type 2D disk, which will store, I believe, 1.2 megabytes. It's almost the same storage as a double density 5 1/4 inch floppy. So there you go. That's a 3274-61C system controller. Came with a, extra floppy drive circuit board. Just as a spare, not sure why. And there's another disc. If you look over on my floor there, I have another one of those controllers with the drive still. I haven't cleaned this one up. This one is untested, but I got 2 of them, so that's one thing. Okay, I'll put the covers back in and we'll go on to the next thing. And yes, it is heavy. There we go. I see your message there. Yes, you're welcome. It's very rare to see any of these sorts of things alive and running anymore. I collect anything I can find, and this was found about a 2-minute drive away from my house. Somebody had these. They were going to start a company archiving 8-inch floppies, and they never got around to it, but they bought these as surplus for that operation. And he saw that I have an ad asking for vintage computer hardware of any sort and offered these to me for free. So I went and I picked them up, and it's something that I just, every now and then you get something you never thought you'd have. And this is it. And if I can find the technical documentation on the internal boards, I may try to write my own firmware for these and see about making them do something for me. There. Sort of tidy again. What next? Here's something interesting. Wise Thin Client is a geode processor, 300 megahertz. I think it holds 32 megs of RAM, and it runs Windows CE. And apparently you can net boot these through TFTP and run Linux on them. So this might be a project coming up soon. Let's have a look inside. Dusty. There we go. Room for an SO-DIMM processor. Probably some sort of non-volatile storage you can insert there. It's got VGA, sound, Ethernet, power, and USB. No legacy keyboard or mouse, unfortunately. But I'll live without that. I'm missing a power connector, so I have to find that or make my own. Let's see if I have any RAM for this thing. I keep boxes and boxes of this stuff. Let's have a look. Might be one in here. These are mostly going to be too new. DDR2, DDR3. No. Quick way to tell if you want old RAM, avoid anything with ball grid arrays, which is like all of this. Here we go. DDR. I need PC 133. No go, no RAM. Oh well. So that can sit for the future. So what else have I got that's interesting? I'll check if anyone's got anything to say. Nope, not so far. Oh, I got a good one. Let's see. So there's a fun instrument. This is going back some years. Spectrum analyzer from the 60s. Takes a sec to get going. It's full of tubes. Oh, we might have another viewer. Okay, I think it's awake now. Not very bright. I might have to set up the camera differently. And she goes. So, as an example, what have I got here that'll spit out RF at this frequency? Well, let's turn on the... Could do this two ways. Let's do FM. So what you'll see, we've got FM, an alignment generator, which is used for calibrating FM radio. WaveTech 3001 frequency generator, which is just a general purpose synthesized frequency generator. What a nice use unit. Clean up a little bit. All right. Power switch on this one's failing. Oh, good. It woke up. All right. So I'm going to handheld the camera here. So this will get a little bit technical. To start with, the frequency on the WaveTech is set digitally by moving these controls. Kind of neat there. So I can do everything from about 1 meg up to 520 megahertz here. I'm at a meg right now. This lets me know if it's locked in, if the PLL is working, and so on. And I can modulate this using FM or AM externally or internally. But I'm not going to be doing that today. I'm going to operate in CW mode, which is continuous wave. So it's just a carrier. Now, on this spectrum analyzer, the center frequency is 500 kilohertz. So internally, there's a 500 kilohertz calibration oscillator, and you can see when I turn it on, up it goes. And of course, I've got the gain set pretty high, so we'll turn the gain down. All right, so if you look at the graticule, it's really hard with the camera. I wish the cords were longer. I could get you closer. But in any case, there is a vernier control for the center frequency. There's a fine and a coarse. So I can move the coarse along, and I can move the fine along to calibrate the center of this analyzer. It doesn't really matter right now what I set it to. All we need to know is that if I want to use an external frequency tuning head, such as, sorry, horrible cameraman, as the WaveTech here, I would need to subtract or add the two frequencies, the 500K center frequency and the frequency of my generator, to find out the frequencies that will be displayed on the analyzer. Now, it's very important to remember whether we're taking the sum of the difference, because that will define whether the display is above or below the frequency measurement of interest. I won't get too far into the technical details of that because it's just distracting. The point is that the difference of those frequencies is going to tell us where we land when we tune to a frequency using this. So we're basically going to make a radio by attaching these two devices together, and then we're going to tune that radio into an FM radio transmitter. So if that all seems to make sense, you'll see on my bench here I've got a little bit of coax coming out. That is so that I can detach the local oscillator connection on the spectrum analyzer from its internal tuning head, which is this unit here. Now I would use this, but it only goes up to 40 megahertz, which is not high enough to get into the FM band for this. So we can't use this. This would be used for tuning HF radio equipment, which I do use it for. It's great for World War II series radios and stuff like that, but I won't be using this. So we'll go back to using the WaveTech here, and all I have to do is disconnect this link, and I think I had a piece of short coax sitting here for this. Of course, you know, for my demonstration, I lose the darn thing. Let me have a look, see if I got it handy. You can look around the bench while I look. It's a mess. There's always stuff all over the place, up and down. Not seeing the coax, so I might have to go and get, well, here it is, hiding over here on the pulse generator. All right. So we're going to attach that to the spectrum analyzer single-handedly with some difficulty. Bingo. All right. Now, this thing can go down to 500K, even though it says it can't. And you'll notice that the input on this analyzer is wobbling right now. That's the heterodyne. That's what this is called. It's the difference between the frequency of the function generator and the frequency of my calibration oscillator, which is still running. Oh, we've got a viewer asking if it's okay to share this video. Yes, that's okay. Let's go back to what I was thinking here. All right, so you see it's quavering a little bit. The amplitude of the internal oscillator is fairly low. And you see if I turn it down, the quavering increases up to a point. That's telling me the amplitude of the internal oscillator is fairly similar to the amplitude of this guy down here. And if I was to turn one of them way up, it sort of swamps the other. Or if I turn the other one up, not much quavering going on. It just sort of swamps the other one right out. So in any case, that's just showing me that my frequency generator is generating 500K, just like this one here. And the fact that they're kind of quavering when they mix is just telling me that the 500K in here is not exactly the same frequency that's 500K in here. This I trust. This is an ovenized crystal oscillator. It's very stable. It's very accurate. The oscillator in here is just an RC circuit. So the fact that it's within, you know, whatever that quavering might be, 10 hertz or so of the PLL in the WaveTech is impressive. So enough about that. There's the frequency coming off the WaveTech direct into the spectrum analyzer. You can increase the sensitivity a little bit. You can align the center so it's right on the middle. All that's fine and dandy. Now let's use this and tune it into a radio station that we're going to make up ourselves. Let's say I want to use FM 100 megahertz. Okay. Normally I would think, oh, okay, I can just go pop, pop. I got 100 meg on the dial. But I need to move off by 500 kilohertz. So I'm just going to go like that. And so now the frequency of this oscillator is 500K higher than the frequency of interest. And since it's going to be mixed with the frequency of interest, which is 100 megahertz, 100.5 minus 100 leaves me with the 0.5, which when is delivered to the mixer in the spectrum analyzer will result in the center frequency, 0.5. Again, I'm going very quickly, and I know this is technical. I'm not going to get into it. I could do a video on that later on heterodyne radio, what this is, but I won't get into it. I just want to show this off so you can see what it looks like. So the next step here is we need a way of connecting our transmitter to our receiver, which is not really a radio audio receiver. It's just going to show us a display. I could use cabling, but I'm going to use an antenna just to show a few things about this. So here's a whip antenna that happens to just sort of go right in here on this thing. It's very handy. So stuff that thing in there. There it is. Now, if we turn the gain up real nice and high, we see noise on this display. This is showing me a sweep about, I think it was a megahertz wide. I forget what the bandwidth, the sweep width on this is, but it's showing me a chunk of the radio band centered around 100 megahertz. Is what I'm picking up. And if I touch the antenna, you can see the strength of those pips gets stronger. So what it's really showing me is that horizontal axis is frequency, ascending to the right, descending to the left, and the vertical axis is amplitude. So if I was to see a radio station that was an FM station or something, I would expect to see a fairly stable pip, as it were, on this display. And its strength would be indicated by the height of the pip, and its frequency would be indicated by its position left to right on the display within within the window that this is reading. It's not going to show me the whole FM band or anything like that. That would be quite a wide sweep. Although there are analyzers that will sweep that far, that's not the case here. So anyway, going back to our radio transmitter, we're going to go and set this to 100 megahertz. So that's going to be right around there. I'm going to set the output really high because I'm not plugging this right into the input of an FM tuner. We're going to set this up with no modulation to begin with. So this is going to just emit 100 megahertz carrier wave, and that's it. There's nothing else happening there. Now the next part is I need a way of getting the signal out of this into that antenna. So I'm going to just set the camera down here, and I'm going to get a cable that will allow me to plug this thing in. So bear with me for a moment. All right. Say hello to the cat. He's loving his little nap. Yeah, he's happy. Okay, so back to this. So I've got myself just a little cable with clip leads. I can attach this to the RF output of the generator, and I can stick it onto the antenna that I've got here. And you'll notice something interesting. See, as I move this, see if I can zoom out a bit. If I move this wire near to the antenna, you'll see a peak. So this is telling me that all my theoretical stuff is working. I got it right, and I was lucky enough to tune the analog dial on this thing very close to 100 megahertz. So it's working, it's transmitting. Now, as I get closer to this, it's going to go up by the square of the distance. If I touch, it's going to just go right off the screen. Well, maybe not off, but it's quite strong. Anyway, there's my FM. I'm just going to decrease the sensitivity a little bit. And you can see I'm getting some noise in the midst of all of this stuff. But if I change the frequency of my FM transmitter, I'm going to wiggle it up and down. Oh, look at that. It just flipped right off the screen. It's gone. There it is. Holy smoke. So you can see just how lucky I was. I'm turning the knob as delicately as I possibly can. I'm just moving it like this, and it's going right off the screen. So we go back over here. I'm going to go real slow. Oh, I lost it. See, beginner's luck. There it is. It goes by so fast. Okay. So I'm going to stop touching that now. We got that thing sitting there. So basically what we've done, I'll just recap. We have this analyzer that is interested in 500 kilohertz in the middle of its sweep. So it's sweeping from some frequency, maybe 450 through 500 to 550 kilocycles a second, which I think is actually what it is doing. So if a frequency was to get onto the center of this display, it would have to be approximately 500 kilocycles. If based on the center tuning of this knob, it can adjust it a little bit. So again, you ask, okay, how do we get 100 megahertz to turn into 500 kilocycles? And this was something I said I wasn't really going to explain earlier. What's going on is in here, there's a circuit called a mixer, and it's doing a process known as heterodyning or modulation. And so what it's doing, we have a nonlinear amplifier circuit that is taking the output of this 100 megahertz signal, and it's taking this 100.5 megahertz signal, and it's sending them both through a special nonlinear circuit. There's many ways to make such circuits. In here, we're using a sharp cutoff tube. I believe it's a 6U8. Don't hold me to that, but I think it is. We're using a vacuum tube that's biased near cutoff to multiply those signals together. It literally makes a mathematical multiplication between the two on their amplitudes. And when you do that, if you were to draw that out, multiply two sine waves together, you would end up with a resultant sine wave pair at the sum and difference frequencies of the two waves that you started with. So for example, if you started with two waves of the same frequency, you would end up with a new wave of double the frequency. So you get and you get the difference too, which would, since 1 minus 1 is 0, you get DC offset. The wave would be offset in magnitude, but sorry, level, not magnitude. Anyway, it just shows the mathematics behind the multiplication process. And again, I say multiply. The frequencies will be the sum and difference of the inputs. It's their amplitudes that are being multiplied. So that has to be taken into account. Going back to the frequencies of interest, since we know that we need to take either the sum or the difference of the two frequencies in order to get the resultant 500K, I had set this to 100.5 megahertz. So it's 500 kilocycles or kilohertz higher than this. So the difference between the two is whatever this frequency this wants to look at. I could go over here and I could actually take this and set this to 99.5, then it'll still work, because now the sum of these two frequencies would be 500. Well, sorry, it would still be the difference. It's just we're taking the difference from the other direction. So please disregard the fact that I said sum. It's not the sum. It would be the difference. But the difference is now it would be, instead of being this frequency, this higher one minus the lower one, the lower one would become the higher one if I go down to 99. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to set this to 99.5. And so now we know that 100 minus 99.5 is still 0.5. You go back over here, and sure enough, there it sits. The only difference now is if I was to move this knob to a higher frequency, the wave would move the opposite way, because the difference is being done in the opposite direction, the opposite order. So that's something to take into consideration when using a spectrum analyzer, or when you're designing the front end of a radio, when you're working on the mixer section. and you're deciding on the IF, the intermediate frequency, you're choosing whether you would take the difference in one direction or the other. There's reasons for both. Generally, it'll be the first case that I did, where the local oscillator is higher than the input, but not in all cases. For example, I'm trying to think. Oh, I don't have any good examples in mind off the top of my head for commercial radios, but I'm sure others will. So suffice it to say, I did a very hasty and very, very loose description of this, but I just wanted to do a visual on what it looks like. Now, one more thing that I can show with this is kind of interesting is we have the carrier wave, again, at 100 megahertz being converted down to 500K for the analyzer. Unfortunately, there's a lot of hash here. I might be able to turn up the amplitude of my source, my local oscillator, and clean this up for you. There we go. Now we got a nice, clean, sort of spectrally pure looking wave. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add something called modulation. I'm just going to adjust the frequency of the transmitter a little. Let's see, and I'm adjusting the frequency up, and the pip is moving down because remember it's 99.5 minus 100 rather than 100.5 minus 100. So this is what a clean sine wave, or what we'd call a spectrally pure sine wave, or a harmonic oscillator, or whatever you want to look at, it has in appearance on a spectrum analyzer. It's not showing what we would call sidebands. If we modulate it, now this again would depend on the modulation we use, whether it's AM, FM, phase, so on and so forth. You start to see an effect that occurs. It's similar to the effect that I described earlier with the heterodyne in the circuit that takes the difference of those two frequencies. And what happens is if you take the carrier frequency and you modulate it with some other frequency, you're going to produce sidebands that are on the top and bottom of that carrier wave, specifically with AM modulation, amplitude modulation. You're doing the same sort of thing that we were doing when we were describing the heterodyne. If I took the AM wave and modulate it with a voice signal of, say, 1 kilohertz, I would see new pips that were plus 1 kilohertz and minus 1 kilohertz. Again, the sum and difference of the carrier and the voice signal that's going in. It's doing the same thing that my mixer circuit in the back of this analyzer is doing. That's how we actually modulate AM radio. And so again, FM is a little bit of a different case. FM has a different bandwidth requirement. It has a different shape on the spectrum analyzer. It has a very different looking harmonic spectrum. I will not describe why that is or the mathematics behind it right now, but I'll show you what it looks like. So going back to this unit, we have some things we can do in order to use it as a transmitter for testing radios. We can give it all sorts of different functions. The most basic one here is monaural, which means we're going to produce a mono audio tone modulated on top of our FM carrier wave. So an AFM radio tuned to this you'd hear this tone. Down here we have the controls for the local oscillator. You can select a 400 hertz tone or a 1K tone, and you can adjust the level of said tone. So if I go back over to the spectrum analyzer, you can see it's quiet right now. It's just a steady carrier. If I begin to modulate it, see this, what happens? This looks very interesting. So it's taking the frequency of that carrier and it's smearing it back and forth over time. And that's what FM is, frequency modulation. Whatever the amplitude of the input is doing, the frequency output of the transmitter is following it. So it's literally zipping that pip back and forth as fast as, well, in this case, 400 cycles per second. I could switch to 1K modulation, and you see, oh, hey, look, we get a neat shape going. It just happens that 1K 100 megs is an integer multiple of 1k, and we're seeing the difference between the two modulating, zipping along each other. Different frequencies of input will give different kind of interesting looking patterns because they're harmonically related to the carrier frequency. And when that happens, you'll see things that tend to look still or static on the display rather than all fuzzy or warbly or whatever. So you can see if I increase the modulation, it's just spreading that frequency all over the place. And that's one of the things with FM radio. It uses a lot of bandwidth. The larger dynamic range you want for your audio, the more bandwidth your FM transmitter uses. So that's why FM radio, when you're listening, is exceptionally tightly limited. It's compressed and limited very, very carefully so that every station sits within the confines of its bandwidth limitation. Otherwise, it starts to literally leak over into the transmissions of other stations and interfere with alternative stations nearby. So yeah, the FCC or Transport Canada governs the rules behind that sort of stuff. In any case, that's what FM looks like on this thing. Again, it's called a spectrum analyzer. It's showing me frequency and amplitude of a signal. Aside from that, I could show a few more things, but that's kind of getting into FM radio theory. You'll see there's a function on here for stereo that engages a function in this generator that transmits a new radio frequency on top of the radio frequency it's already transmitting. It's basically a station within a station, and it's at 19 kilohertz pilot tone, and the station itself is at 38 kilohertz, just a ways outside of the audio band. And in order to get stereo, they do some funky stuff with the audio and transmit that funky stuff on that 38 kilohertz radio station inside the 100 megahertz radio station. That's something I'm not going to get into right now, how it works, but in a nutshell, FM stereo has a station within a station. Unfortunately, let's see if I can look at this FM stereo pilot tone by modulating my carrier with it. The thing with the pilot tone is it's not very much modulation, so you usually won't see much when you do this sort of thing. I can turn up the audio modulation, but if I turn up the 19 kilohertz carrier, I don't really see much. The amplitude kind of drops a little bit. There's a little bit of a frequency spread happening, but the spectrum analyzer bandwidth isn't narrow enough to resolve it, so I don't see it, because it's only something like 25% modulation. It's not very much. I could change some settings and get that to actually show up, but I'm not going to get into that right now. So in any case, that's a piece of gear that works on a theory that's been around for a long time, and we still do this sort of thing to this day, although we use a more modern machine such as something like that. That does it all digitally. It does fast Fourier transforms. It actually calculates the Fourier series. It has a hell of a lot more precision, and so on and so forth. It's also a lot newer. Back in the day when this was made, around 1963, we didn't have computers that could do that in real time and fit on your desk. There was no way. So it was all done analog, and the whole thing is just a gigantic radio. One thing I can add to this I didn't mention, I should have mentioned, is the fact that this line is being drawn repeatedly. It's sweeping, just like an oscilloscope. And while it sweeps, the internal radio tuner in this thing is being tuned to successively higher frequencies. And you recall I said 500 kilohertz was the center, and we were maybe starting at 450 and ending at 550. So what this whole unit is a radio that self-tunes, and it just ramps up its tuner repeatedly in time, very, very quickly. And the output of the tuner is taken to give us the the y-axis, the vertical axis. So the stronger any stations it senses, the higher the dot goes. And the x-axis is just telling us where the tuner happens to be at that point in time, what frequency it's tuned into. So it's all happening so fast that persistence of vision allows you to see a little slice of a given band of radio stations and their relative amplitudes, and some other information about them. So that's the basic concept of this machine. And its original use was for designing and calibrating radios in military service. In this particular unit, this analyzer head out of this box would have been installed in all sorts of different applications. You name it. I mean, it wouldn't matter. But basic point was they were using them to make sure that radio transmitters were working properly. They were correctly tuned. They weren't producing harmonic distortion, which would cause interference with other transmissions. So that's kind of its job in life. And it so happens that this tuning head that came with it is basically made for the bands of interest in those days, which works from about 2 megahertz up to 40 megahertz. So the HF bands, basically allowing it to operate on all the sorts of shortwave and HF radios that some of us old ham radio operators love to have, such as myself. So this thing actually sees a lot of use. That's why it's up on my bench rather than sitting in a museum or in the crawl space where some of the other interesting test equipment is living. Maybe I'll make videos of them. So long-winded, rough, hopefully slightly informative, but hopefully interesting. This is one more thing I can share. So that's that. And I think for the moment, I'm going to pretty much end this live stream. I've been at it for, goodness knows, must be nearly 3 hours now. And this was just a test, just to see if the whole live streaming thing works. Seems like it does, and I'll come back with more in the future. And if you feel like buying me a coffee, I love coffee. Bye. Oh, and the cat. We'll stop with the cat.